Has someone ever told you that when building a battery box or radio go box, that you should get the largest battery that will fit and the one with the most amp hours you can afford? Let's take a closer look and see why that advice might not be as good as you think. Hi, and welcome to the Gadget Talk channel, where we do reviews and how-tos on a variety of electronic gadgets that catch my eye. In this video, we're going to take a look at some factors you should consider when scaling a battery to a new battery box, power box, radio go box, or whatever you call it. By way of an overview, we're going to start out with a discussion of radio power output, duty cycle, and transmission modes. Next, we'll discuss some rules of thumb that will get you pretty close and the math computation that will get you very close to figuring out the battery capacity that will best meet your needs. We'll wrap things up with a couple of battery factors you'll want to consider. Before we jump in, let's take just a second to define a couple of terms. Most of you will already understand this, but for the new folks, please indulge me. The four terms are power measured in watts, voltage measured in volts, current measured in amps, and resistance measured in ohms. You may remember this chart. These terms are indicated by E, I, and R. The chart also shows you that you can solve for the missing variable by either multiplying amps times resistance to get volts, or dividing volts by current or resistance to get resistance or current. Power is shown in this chart. P is the symbol for power measured in watts, and E and I remain defined as current and voltage. Now, if we know two of the three variables, we can compute the third the same way we did with the previous memory aid. To kick things off, we need to discuss radio RF output versus power use. Several 100-watt output HF rigs have amp usage when transmitting of about 20 amps. If you jump to the power chart, you might be tempted to multiply 20 amps by 13.8 volts to get RF power output. When you do that math, you get something like 276, which is way above the 100-watt advertised output. So, what went wrong? There are two things happening in this radio that you didn't account for in that easy but wrong computation. First is what I call the radio's administrative power load. By this I mean the current required to push through the circuits, light the display screen, and other tasks the radio does all the time. The second thing is the efficiency of the radio's final amplifiers. Amplifier efficiency can be easily in the 50% range. That means amps are used during the process, but that power doesn't leave as RF from the antenna. So, if we're working with an HF radio that lists the power output when transmitting, we're lucky, and we'll use that figure a little later on. For mobile radios, finding the power consumption can be a bit harder. Top-of-the-line mobile rigs like the Yaesu FTM400 list power consumption for both VHF and UHF. In the case of the FTM400, it's 11 and 12 amps for VHF and UHF, respectively. Less expensive mobile rigs often don't list power consumption. For example, the Oshan KG1000G Plus GMRS 50-watt mobile rig and my QB25 and DB25G mini mobiles don't list power consumption. As you can see in this clip, the best way to obtain this number is to put an ammeter in line with the power lead and see what you get when you key the mic. So in this clip, I've got the DB25G radio, and I've inserted this ammeter in line in the power And so you can see on a low GMRS channel, channel 2, it's pulling about 1.9 amps just in the receive mode. I've got it hooked up to a dummy load, so I'm not transmitting outward. So let's push the push to talk button and see what kind of amperage we get on low power with this radio. So we got about 1.73 amps on low power. So that's really not very much with 5 watts going out. Now let's change the GMRS channel and go up to one of the high power channels and see what we get there. Okay, so now we're up on GMRS channel 19, and so we'll hit the push to talk button and see what we get here. So we've got about 3.83 amps here on high power, and when I've tested this radio, it transmits at about 15 or 16 watts. So we've got 3.86 at 16 watts output. In the case of my DB25G Mini Mobile, the total amp draw on high power was just under 4 amps. The next factor we need to discuss is duty cycle. Duty cycle typically refers to the ratio of the time a transmitter is actually producing full power and when it's at rest. You may remember that duty cycle is discussed in Section 9 of the licensing manual dealing with safety. You use duty cycle to compute exposure to RF radiation. In this case, we're using duty cycle to help compute our total amp draw. Transmission mode in this application is closely related to duty cycle. To get our best estimate of our power consumption, we need to understand the transmission mode we'll be using. That's because the duty cycle of some modes are only a fraction of the rated power consumption. Here are some generally agreed upon duty cycles listed by transmission mode. AM and FM transmissions are 100% duty cycles. Digital modes are also 100% duty cycle. CW is about 44% duty cycle, and single sideband is about 20% duty cycle. To get your best estimate of your power consumption, you'll need to estimate your duty cycle based on your anticipated transmission mode. For example, if we go back to our 100 watt HF radio with a 20 amp power consumption on transmit, our actual consumption would be only 20% of that 20 amps if we were doing single sideband for some parks on the air. On the other hand, we'd use the full amount if we were doing FT8. Now that we have some of that background out of the way, let's focus on the computations. You may remember that I mentioned a rule of thumb that will get you in the power consumption ballpark. That rule is to use 1 amp of current for every 5 watts of output at 100% duty cycle. My little FM Mini Mobile outputs about 15 watts as I've measured it. That means I'd expect 3 amps of current when transmitting, since the FM signals are 100% duty cycle. My actual measurement, you recall, was about 3.86, which is pretty darn close. For the 100 watt output, we divide 100 by 5 and get 20. That's the published consumption figure for many 100 watt radios. So again, it's pretty close. But keep in mind, that's at a 100% duty cycle. What about other modes? We'll use this formula for a more accurate computation that takes transmission mode into effect. This formula also adds a time factor into the mix. It will help us answer the question, how big a battery will I need to operate X number of hours? So here's the formula that we'll be using. Here's what all that stuff means. First, transmit percent is the transmit percent. Transmit amps is transmit amperage. DC is the duty cycle. Receive percentage is the percent the receiver's on. RX amps is the receive amps. DH is the desired hours, and RAH are the required amp hours. So in our example, we'll use a single sideband transmission at 100 watts. Here are the key elements, and we're going to want to operate for 4 hours. So let's plug these variables into the formula and see what we get. So at 2.4 amps each hour times 4 gives us 9.6 amp hours. In example number 2, we're going to use a 50-50 transmit-receive ratio because we're going to be using FT8. Let's plug those numbers into the formula. As you can see, the duty cycle makes a huge difference in the amount of amps each hour and the total number of amp hours required. Now, let's take a look at the results from a nice little online calculator. I found that this calculator computes slightly higher levels than the formula that we just went through, and I'm not sure about what other things might be in this calculation. In fact, in a couple of cases it was right on, but on others it read slightly higher. This first shot shows the result for our single sideband example. This next shot shows the result of our FT8 example. In any case, it's better to be a little high than a little low, and it's really simple to use. I'll have the link in the description below. As we close things out here, let's take just a moment or two to discuss some battery characteristics you'll want to consider. First, the formula doesn't care where the electricity comes from. Amps are amps, whether you're connected to a deep cycle AGM battery or a LiFePO4. Lead-acid batteries like the deep cycle will be much heavier, and most people recommend only discharging them to 50% of their rated value. That means a 100 amp hour battery has only 50 usable amp hours. The other thing about lead-acid batteries is that their discharge curve is a fairly straight, downward sloping curve. Since most radios require 3.8 amps plus or minus 15%, your lead-acid battery's capacity ends at about 11.3 volts, regardless of the amp hours used. Discharge charts often show that voltage is well under the recommended 50% discharge level, however. Your best choice, in my opinion, for a ham radio battery box is going to be a lithium iron phosphate battery or LiFePO4 battery. The LiFePO4 represents the symbols for the chemical makeup of the battery. LiFePO4 batteries have two big advantages. First, they are much lighter. That makes them easy to take along with you on your outdoor adventures. As a comparison, a typical 50 amp hour LiFePO battery weighs in at about 18 pounds, while a 100 amp hour AGM battery comes in at about 60 pounds. Remember, you'll only be discharging to about 50%. The next big advantage to LiFePO4 batteries is their discharge curve. These batteries will show a small drop when they first go to work and then level off at about 13.5 volts. They stay there until just before they run out of power. At that point, they fall off dramatically. This means that you'll have a solid, steady-state voltage right up until the end. This also means that battery meters that depict battery capacity based on voltage won't be much good. I hope you've seen that the advice to buy the biggest, highest capacity battery you can afford might not be the best. How you plan to use your radio, including what power output you plan on using, is a big part of your decision. Carrying around extra weight and consistently bringing home unused battery capacity means you've spent money you could have used elsewhere. If you'd like to see a review of a power box designed for hams and other radio enthusiasts, join me over here where we take a look at the Gigaparts Explorer Deluxe battery box. As always, if you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe to the Gadget Talk channel. Thanks for watching, and 73.